Welcome back to True Echo, where powerful stories come to life, unfiltered, unforgettable, and painfully real. The airport hummed with chaos, like a hive in disarray. People darted in every direction beneath towering glass ceilings and glowing departure boards. Flight announcements sputtered from overhead speakers, a constant backdrop to the bustle. But in one sharp, stunning instant, all of it stopped. A loud crack cut through the terminal like a whip. The sound came not from a dropped suitcase or a child's shriek, but from the open palm of a uniformed woman striking another across the cheek. A phone hit the glossy floor with a sickening clang. All eyes turned. There, in the center of the commotion, stood Alicia Bennett, graceful, poised, and now visibly shaken, her hand rising slowly to her stinging cheek. Her phone skidded several feet across the polished tiles. The slap hadn't come from a criminal or a crazed stranger, but from Caroline Whitmore, a senior flight attendant in a crisp navy uniform, her name badge gleaming under the airport lights like a misplaced medal. Caroline stood tall, arms crossed, eyes hard. Her voice rang out in brittle, clipped tones. "I've been very clear," she said with disdain. "Step aside. First class is not for people like you." A deathly hush rippled through the concourse. It wasn't just the physical assault that stunned the crowd, but the venom in Caroline's words, laced with centuries of exclusion, of disdain masked as decorum. The atmosphere thickened, heavy with disbelief and tension. Some reached for their phones. Others gasped. Many simply stared, breath held. Alicia didn't retaliate. She didn't yell or argue. She bent slowly to retrieve her phone with a quiet dignity that only deepened the contrast between her and Caroline. Straightening her shoulders, Alicia looked Caroline square in the eye. Her voice was soft, but every syllable carried weight. "You've just made the gravest mistake of your career." The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. The murmurs halted. People leaned in. Caroline's lips curled into a smirk of disbelief, but her eyes, those told a different story. Beneath the smug veneer was the first flicker of fear. "Are you threatening me?" she asked, her tone uncertain now. "I'm informing you," Alicia said evenly. "You'll understand soon enough." Nearby, Sebastian Drake, a rising tech entrepreneur, had been watching from a corner of the VIP lounge. He had offered Alicia his seat earlier. She declined with quiet grace. Now, he watched her again, not just in admiration, but with a new sense of awe. Alicia exuded something unnameable. Power without arrogance. Strength without spectacle. Sebastian's eyes narrowed. He knew this was no ordinary passenger. And Caroline had no idea who she had just struck. An hour earlier, Alicia had been seated quietly in the glass-enclosed VIP lounge, thumbing through her messages on a sleek smartphone. Dressed in a jade-green dress that whispered elegance rather than screamed wealth, she was the picture of serene composure. Her presence didn't demand attention, it commanded it. Across the lounge, Caroline Whitmore had walked in with the air of a queen surveying her court. As the airline's longest-tenured flight attendant, she carried herself like a gatekeeper of luxury, one who believed she could spot the unworthy from 100 paces. When she saw Alicia, a young black woman seated alone, she didn't bother checking credentials. Caroline's eyes narrowed instantly. She saw an outsider. Not a CEO. Not a shareholder. Just another person she'd quietly classify as mistakenly placed. She walked out of the lounge with a mental note already made, one that would later become her undoing. At the first-class gate, Caroline had waited like a sentinel, checking tickets with efficiency and just enough charm for those she deemed appropriate. But when Alicia stepped forward, graceful cane in hand, Caroline's expression darkened. "I can't imagine someone like you affording this ticket," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Must be an error." Alicia raised a brow. "I suggest you scan the pass instead of making assumptions." Caroline scoffed, took the boarding pass, and let it dangle from her fingertips like something contagious. The crowd shifted uneasily. Then Caroline did the unthinkable. With a flick of her wrist, she struck Alicia's hand. Alicia's phone and wallet crashed to the floor. Her cane, already unsteady, toppled beside them. Caroline didn't flinch. She stood as if she had simply performed her duty, preserving the sanctity of luxury. "You don't belong here," she sneered. And Alicia, still upright, still calm, replied with only one chilling sentence. "You've humiliated the wrong person." This time, Sebastian Drake stepped forward. But before he could speak, a deep, commanding voice rang out over the crowd. "What on earth is going on here?" Heads turned. Caroline turned pale. The voice sliced through the air like a razor. Every head in the terminal turned toward the man approaching with a commanding presence and crisp, authoritative stride. Richard Montgomery, Senior Vice President of Global Operations for Skylinks Airlines, was known among employees as the Iron Spine. Even captains paused when he spoke. And now, his expression was unreadable as he looked from the tense crowd to the crumpled boarding pass at Alicia's feet. Caroline Whitmore's lips parted slightly, but no words emerged. She was frozen, her brain scrambling for an explanation that wouldn't sink her further. "I asked," Richard said again, his tone cold as steel, "what is going on here?" Caroline attempted to compose herself. "Mr. Montgomery, I was addressing a disturbance. This passenger." "That passenger," Richard cut in, raising his hand toward Alicia, "is Alicia Bennett. Our CEO." The silence was no longer just thick. It was suffocating. Caroline blinked. Once. Twice. Then the color drained from her face. Richard's tone turned harsher. "And what I witnessed just now, what dozens of premium passengers witnessed, was unacceptable conduct. Physical aggression. Racial prejudice. Public humiliation." He didn't need to shout. His voice carried the weight of command. Alicia, still calm, gave Richard a small, acknowledging nod. She hadn't spoken a word since her warning. Her silence had done more damage than any argument could. Her silence made Caroline look smaller by the second. Caroline opened her mouth again, but no one was listening. Behind Richard, Captain Jonathan Reynolds appeared, flanked by Stephen Caldwell, Executive Vice President. Their expressions were carved from stone. "Ms. Whitmore," Richard said, "you are to come with us to the cockpit. Immediately." Caroline stood motionless. Her feet wouldn't move. The passengers in line parted like the Red Sea as Caroline passed, her heels echoing like a funeral march. She didn't meet a single pair of eyes. Sebastian Drake watched her with quiet reproach, while Abigail Mercer, a PR executive who had once flown with Caroline and admired her poise, now turned away in disgust. Back in first class, Alicia returned to her seat. Not once had she raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her very presence had delivered the verdict. Inside the cockpit, the air was cold, not from the temperature, but from the mood. Captain Reynolds didn't bother sitting. "Close the door behind you." Caroline obeyed. Stephen Caldwell leaned forward, fingers laced, his voice even more biting than Richard's. "Do you even understand what you've done, Caroline?" I didn't know who she was," Caroline stammered. "Didn't know," the captain snapped, "or didn't care?" There was no answer. "You didn't check the system," Caldwell continued. "You judged her on sight." Caroline felt her throat tighten. "I just..." "No," Captain Reynolds interrupted. "You didn't just do anything. You assaulted our CEO. In front of first-class passengers. Because of how she looked." Caroline trembled. For the first time in her career, she realized, she had no defense. The cockpit was dead silent, save for the quiet, mechanical hum of the aircraft systems. Caroline stood under the harsh white lights, her perfectly tailored uniform suddenly feeling like a costume she no longer had the right to wear. Stephen Caldwell leaned back, expression unreadable. "Caroline," he said slowly, do you remember our core brand value? Caroline nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Respect. Integrity. Excellence. And today, Captain Reynolds said flatly, you violated all three. Caroline's knees wobbled. Stephen leaned forward. What angers us most isn't the slap. It's not even the prejudice, as heinous as that is. It's that you didn't care enough to verify. You went off instinct, and your instinct was bigotry. Tears burned at the corners of Caroline's eyes. Her mouth opened again, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't run. She couldn't blame anyone else. She had to stand there and absorb every word, each one a blow harder than the last. Stephen stood up, walking slowly toward the door. You'll return to the cabin. You will apologize to Ms. Bennet. Not quietly. Not discreetly. You will do it in front of every single passenger who witnessed your disgraceful behavior. Is that understood? Caroline's voice cracked. Yes, sir. And Caroline, Captain Reynolds added sharply, this isn't about saving face. This is about showing everyone, especially yourself, that dignity does not come from a uniform, but from how you treat people. As the door hissed open, Caroline took one last breath of false pride and stepped out into the corridor. Each footstep back toward first class felt like a sentence being carried out. In the cabin, the tension hadn't lifted. Passengers sat upright, whispering quietly. Alicia sat calmly, legs crossed, eyes ahead. She had not once called for Caroline's dismissal. She had not demanded special treatment. That quiet self-possession had done more damage to Caroline's arrogance than any formal reprimand ever could. Caroline approached, stopping just beside Alicia's seat. Her voice shook as she spoke. Ms. Bennet. I sincerely apologize for my disrespectful and wrongful behavior earlier. I insulted and humiliated you. My actions were unacceptable. Alicia didn't speak. Passengers leaned forward slightly. All eyes were on the two women, one broken, one unbothered. Alicia slowly turned to Caroline. I don't think everyone heard you, Ms. Whitmore. Please repeat it. It wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. Accountability. Caroline felt her stomach drop. But she knew Alicia was right. She raised her voice. I, Caroline Whitmore, formally apologize to Alicia Bennet, CEO of this airline. I was wrong to insult you, and to act with prejudice and disrespect. I fully acknowledge my mistake and accept responsibility for the harm I caused. The words echoed down the aisle. Alicia gave a single, solemn nod. Only then did Caroline turn away, her heart pounding, her face flushed with humiliation. As she walked down the aisle toward the galley, Alicia's voice stopped her once more. Ms. Whitmore. One question. Caroline turned slowly. If I hadn't been the CEO, if I were just another black passenger, would you have offered that apology? Caroline's breath caught. Silence fell again. Everyone waited. Her voice faltered. Her eyes dropped. I probably wouldn't have. Gasps rippled through the cabin like tiny thunderclaps. Alicia didn't smirk. Didn't gloat. Her voice was steady. That's the problem, Ms. Whitmore. You owe your apology not just to me, but to every person you've ever judged without cause. Caroline had no reply. Only shame. Caroline stood motionless, her shoulders caving beneath the unbearable weight of truth. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths as Alicia's words continued to echo in her ears, not loud, but seismic. There was no comeback, no justification, no defense. The cabin remained painfully quiet. Passengers who had initially looked away from the confrontation earlier were now leaning forward, eyes fixed on Caroline. Some wore expressions of pity. Most, disappointment. A few, disdain. She forced herself to move. Her feet dragged down the aisle like they were shackled, each step toward the rear galley a walk deeper into her own shame. She wanted nothing more than to hide. But there was no hiding here. Not anymore. Near the back, she caught the stern gaze of Sebastian Drake. The young entrepreneur had remained quiet until now, but as she passed his row, his voice broke the stillness. "Caroline," he said, low but firm. She turned slowly. "I think you need to hear something else," he continued. "Something that's not going to be easy." She nodded mutely. There was no room left for pride. "I've watched people like you my entire life. People who act with complete confidence, judging others in a second, as if they carry the scale of who's worthy. You didn't just mess up today. You revealed something deep, about yourself, about how many like you operate. What's worse is you probably didn't even think twice when you did it." His voice never rose. He didn't accuse or shout. He simply delivered truth. "That's what prejudice does," he said. "It becomes invisible to the one carrying it." Caroline swallowed hard. Her throat was dry. She tried to respond, but her lips trembled and no words came. Just then, Richard Montgomery approached from the front, walking with purpose. "Ms. Whitmore," he said quietly but clearly enough for those nearby to hear, "step into the galley with me." She obeyed instantly, following him behind the curtain where some semblance of privacy remained. Richard looked at her for a long moment. "Do you understand yet?" She nodded, barely. "No," he said flatly. "I need to be sure." His words were not angry, they were exhausted. The disappointment of a man who had believed his people knew better. "You didn't fail at customer service, Caroline. You failed at basic decency." Tears streamed silently down her face. Richard continued, "When you judged Alicia Bennett, you weren't just wrong about her position. You were wrong about everything. About her worth, her intelligence, her identity. And it wasn't your first time. Was it?" Caroline's voice cracked as she whispered, "No. It wasn't." He nodded grimly. "That's the most honest thing you've said all day." Then he said something she didn't expect. "Alicia asked me not to fire you." Her eyes widened. What? "She insisted," Richard said. "She believes punishment won't teach you what self-reflection will. That sparing your position might force you to actually confront the poison you carry inside." Caroline was stunned. "She offered you mercy," he said, "so you could earn back your integrity." And that, somehow, broke Caroline more than any punishment could have. Alicia could have destroyed her, and instead, she offered a chance. A second chance. "Caroline," Richard said as he turned to leave, "you will serve Ms. Bennett for the remainder of this flight. And every gesture, every interaction, you will treat her with the respect you failed to give her before. You'll do it not to save your job, but to start rebuilding the character you lost." Then he paused and looked back over his shoulder. "If you can't do that, then resign when we land." Caroline stood motionless for a long moment after Richard left, her heart pounding like a drum in a funeral procession. Serve Alicia Bennett? After everything? It felt like walking barefoot over shattered glass. But deep down, she knew, this wasn't punishment. It was her reckoning. The beginning of a brutal, necessary unlearning. She straightened her spine, wiped her face with a trembling hand, and walked back toward first class. As she pulled the curtain aside, all conversation ceased. The cabin quieted again, but this time, it wasn't tension, it was anticipation. Alicia sat serenely near the window, a glass of untouched sparkling water on her tray table. Her posture remained regal, yet relaxed. The embodiment of grace under fire. Caroline approached with tentative steps. Her voice, still cracked with emotion, barely rose above a whisper. "Ms. Bennett, may I bring you anything?" Alicia looked up slowly, her deep eyes unwavering. There was no malice, no triumph, only a quiet, measured calm that made Caroline feel utterly transparent. Yes, Alicia replied softly. Just a glass of water, please. Caroline blinked. That was it? She nodded and turned toward the galley. When she returned, her hand trembled slightly as she placed the fresh glass of water on Alicia's tray. Thank you, Alicia said gently. And that simple kindness, polite, effortless, struck Caroline harder than any scolding ever had. The rest of the flight passed in a blur. Caroline checked on Alicia often, refilling her glass, offering blankets, asking if she needed anything. Each interaction was met with polite acknowledgement. No demands. No scorn. Just grace. But that silence taught more than words ever could. Other passengers watched every moment. Sebastian Drake nodded slightly each time Caroline returned to Alicia's side. His gaze was no longer condemning, just observant, as if watching to see if she'd really change. Abigail Mercer, seated just across the aisle, didn't say a word. But her side glances, stern and steady, made sure Caroline remembered the weight of her actions. Later in the flight, Alicia finally spoke, not with confrontation, but with clarity. I hope you understand, she said as Caroline bent to adjust her tray, that what you're experiencing isn't punishment. It's an opportunity. Caroline paused. An opportunity, she repeated faintly. To grow, Alicia said. To reflect. You can either carry this shame forever, or let it change you. Caroline looked at her, eyes glistening. I want to change. Then start by asking yourself why you believed I didn't belong, Alicia said gently. Not because of what I do. But because of how I look. That's the real root. Caroline bowed her head. The truth hurt, but it also opened a door she'd never dared to approach. Alicia didn't speak further. She didn't need to. Her message had been delivered. And Caroline, once the queen of the aisle, now stood humbled in the presence of the very woman she tried to dismiss. The final hour of the flight passed beneath a veil of uneasy quiet. As the plane began its descent, the golden hue of the setting sun bathed the cabin in warm light. Passengers remained hushed, their eyes flicking from the runway ahead to Alicia and Caroline, two women whose silent battle had transformed an entire flight. Caroline made one last walk through the cabin, ensuring everything was in order. She approached Alicia's seat for a final check, her voice still timid. Ms. Bennett, we'll be landing shortly. Is there anything else I can do for you? Alicia turned and held her gaze. Her expression was soft, but serious. Yes, she said, her tone quiet but deeply firm. Answer me something honestly. Caroline nodded slowly, her heart already bracing for the question she somehow knew was coming. Alicia's eyes pierced into her. Do you truly understand why you behaved that way? Why you thought I didn't belong? Caroline froze. Her throat tightened. For a moment, she wanted to say yes, to give some polished answer. But that instinct, that need to preserve herself, was the exact thing she was supposed to unlearn. So instead, she spoke the truth. I really don't know. Not fully. It was automatic. A reflex I didn't even question, she admitted, her voice raw. I saw you, and I assumed. I let those assumptions guide everything I did. And I'm ashamed of that. Alicia studied her for a long moment. Then gave a single, solemn nod. Admitting that, she said, is the beginning. No lecture. No grand speech. Just that. It was enough. As the wheels touched down with a soft thud, a wave of relief and tension washed over the cabin. When the doors finally opened and the passengers began to disembark, many paused to thank Alicia, some with a glance, others with quiet words of support. She smiled politely but said little. Caroline lingered by the front exit, her posture no longer rigid. No longer defensive. When Alicia approached, she hesitated. For one final time, Alicia looked at her, not as a subordinate, not as a judge, but as a human being. And then she walked past without another word. That, more than anything, stung Caroline. Not because Alicia owed her anything, but because she had offered so much already. Dignity. Forgiveness. Even mercy. Once all passengers had left, Caroline followed the operations team into a private conference room inside the terminal. She expected immediate termination. Instead, she found Alicia seated alongside Richard Montgomery and Stephen Caldwell. The room was tense but not hostile. Richard began. "Caroline, your conduct today severely violated our values. Under ordinary circumstances, your employment would be terminated without hesitation." Caroline nodded, lips pressed together. "But," Richard continued, "Ms. Bennett has made a recommendation." Caroline looked up, confused. Alicia spoke, her voice calm. "Terminating you won't undo the harm. It won't fix the deeper problem. But confronting it, living through the consequences, learning from them, might." Caroline's breath caught. "We're placing you in a mandatory 6-month leadership and sensitivity retraining program," Stephen added. "You'll be monitored, evaluated, and required to complete reflection assignments. You'll be removed from flight duties in the meantime." It was mercy, but it wasn't leniency. It was a mirror held up to her soul. Caroline could barely speak. "Thank you, for this chance." Alicia met her eyes, serene but unwavering. "Make it count." As Caroline exited the building and stepped out into the night air, she felt lighter, but not because she was forgiven. Because she had finally faced the truth of who she was. Behind her, in the glass-paneled office above, Alicia stood by the window watching the tarmac, silent and still. She had been publicly humiliated. She had been assaulted. But she had not lost her dignity. She had reminded everyone, including the woman who struck her, what real power looked like. This wasn't just a story about humiliation or revenge. It was a story about what happens when we dare to confront the ugliness inside us. And what becomes possible when dignity, truth, and courage walk into the room. Welcome to True Echo, where real stories leave real impact. In today's powerful episode, a black woman is slapped by a flight attendant, only for the entire airport to freeze when the truth is revealed. She's not just any passenger. She's the CEO of the airline. What follows is a stunning lesson in prejudice, power, and grace you'll never forget. This story isn't just about one woman standing up to injustice. It's about the courage to speak up, the strength in staying calm, and the grace to choose growth over revenge. As Alicia Bennett showed us, true power isn't in titles, it's in how you carry yourself, even when no one believes in who you are. If you were in Alicia's position, would you choose to forgive, or would you seek retribution? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe to True Echo for more unforgettable stories that challenge what we believe, and who we are.